just encountered Shakespeare watching the Brady Bunch, so that shows you the kind of introduction to Shakespeare that I had.
So Dr. Kate Flaherty is Senior Lecturer in English and Drama at the Australian National University. She researches how Shakespeare's works play on the stage of public culture.
He built his own theatre with the help of his friends and sharers. He acted on its stage, so he has a really exquisite sense of how body and space make meaning. Shakespeare himself in his plays shows that he is aware he's dealing with dark materials. I wonder if it's a case of shared risk. You only have to think about the tech industry today and social media. This is a new social technology, so it's fairly unregulated, I suppose. Drama needs change and conflict.
Hello, welcome along again to Re-Enchanting. I'm Justin Brierley.
And I'm Belle Tindall.
And this is the show where we aim to re-enchant an arguably secular, materialist world with the Christian vision of reality. We're always looking for your reviews, your feedback. So if you're listening or watching, do give us a thumbs up or some stars on the podcast review. It'd be lovely to hear what you think of today's show. And we've got a fabulous guest for you today, haven't we, Belle?
So fabulous. I say this all the time, but I really, really mean it. And I mean it so much today. And that's that I'm so excited that you're here, Kate. I'm just going to give you your introduction. So for our listeners, let me introduce you to our wonderful guest for today. So Dr. Kate Flaherty is Senior Lecturer in English and Drama at the Australian National University. She researches how Shakespeare's works play on the stage of public culture, which is such a good line. Her insights have been published in Contemporary Theatre Review, New Theatre Quarterly, Australian Studies and Shakespeare Survey. And she is also the author of the book Hours as We Play It, Australia Plays Shakespeare, and the author of the latest volume of the Cambridge Elements series entitled Ellen Terry, Shakespeare and Suffrage in Australia and New Zealand.
So today we're going to be re-enchanting Shakespeare with Kate. Thank you so much, Kate, for joining us. And I was delighted to receive your email because you're not just someone we've randomly sort of contacted out the blue. You've sort of contacted us as a listener of Re-Enchanting. So this is kind of a listener special in many ways. Thank you so much. It was so nice to receive the email. Do you mind me asking how you stumbled upon us in the first place? How you came to start listening to Re-Enchanting?
Some friends suggested both the Re-Enchanting podcast and the Surprising Rebirth podcast.
Oh.
So shout out to Poppy and Rachel.
Well, brilliant. Well, it's always good. Word of mouth is the best way of these things being passed along. Well, as a regular Re-Enchanting listener, you will know that our signature question, as we normally record on top of Lambeth Palace Library, is what are you currently reading, Kate?
As usual, I'm reading multiple things at once. Some a little more work related than others, but work blends into fun for me. So I've got two biographical works on the go. I'm reading Ellen Terry's own autobiography, and I'm also reading a recent biography of Nellie Melba, because the work that Belle mentioned on Ellen Terry's 1914 tour to Australia also deals with the friendship that blossomed between those two women in 1914. And so I'm writing a play this year about their friendship and thinking about friendship in international movements, political movements, and in this case, women's suffrage. So those two books that are biographical, and then I'm reading or rereading Ali Smith's wonderful book, Artful, which I don't know how to classify as genre. She is, of course, a fiction author, but this is a contemplation of art and the place of art in life, and it's just magnificent. And another book that's hard to classify that I'm reading is Stan Grant's book, Marianne, Song of Time. So Stan Grant is an author, a theologian, a journalist of Australian Indigenous background. And I'm just reading here the title of the first part of his book is A Gift, and it is indeed, he calls it a psalter. So Wiradjuri book of prayer. And again, it's a beautiful and complex meditation on the spiritual life, on God, on nature and the world.
That list was everything I hoped it would be. I think a couple of series ago now, because I think it was a couple of years ago, we had Helen Lewis on, and she's written a book about dangerous, or quote unquote dangerous women, as in women who were very involved in suffrage. And I remember really being struck reading her book and talking to her about the underplayed importance of friendship when it came to the suffrage movements. And so that just makes me so excited that you've picked up on that and are going to take a friendship to tell that story. Something else I imagine is you're always kind of reading, albeit I imagine with different intensities, is of course the work of Shakespeare. And I would just love to hear your story really about how I think a lot of our listeners might be in the category of sort of, we appreciate Shakespeare and we love it because we feel we should, because we're told it's genius work.
That's me, Kate. Okay, I'm going to hold my hand up and say I do not read as much Shakespeare as I probably should read. In fact, I actually just recently, literally on the bookshelf behind me, I've recently acquired the full works of Shakespeare, holding up for the camera here. And
Which edition have you got, Justin?
Well, this is, let me see. It just calls it a beautiful box set. And I can't tell immediately what edition this was. It was secondhand, so I haven't really looked. But it's my New Year's resolution to actually start reading some of the plays of Shakespeare. So sorry, I interrupted you, Belle, but
no. Well, I'm just wondering, Kate, how you moved from being someone who feels like they should love Shakespeare to being someone who really has been shaped and impacted and moulded by his work and his words.
I never felt that I should love Shakespeare. I was very, very fortunate. I didn't have the misfortune of being forced or expected to like Shakespeare. My parents had very different kind of educational opportunities to the ones that they afforded me through their hard work. And so I had the amazing experience of discovering Shakespeare more or less for myself through school. I first encountered Shakespeare watching the Brady Bunch. So that shows you the kind of introduction to Shakespeare that I had as an Australian kid. And then my parents took me to England when I was about 9 and showed me the Tower of London. So all things Tudor and English history became fascinating to me. But then in high school, I began to be interested in drama, and this name Shakespeare was floating around as having something important to do with drama. So I wanted to jump in at the deep end. And I discovered that Shakespeare was story making that I could stand up and walk around in. And I loved the chewy syntax. I loved the thoughts within the thoughts of Shakespeare's language. It expressed something of how my own thought patterns worked. And then I had the good fortune of being cast as Viola in Twelfth Night at school, and then Juliet in the first year play readings at university. So I guess I came to it from the inside. Even that first day on the bus, I remember in year 10 reading Macbeth and reading The Witches and thinking, oh, this is exciting. So it was a kind of idyllic introduction to Shakespeare. Yeah. There was absolutely no should about it. In fact, the caution in me felt like you can't have too much of this stuff. It's just too good.
Yeah, so our children have all at some point acted bits and pieces of Shakespeare in drama productions at school. I was Cassius in Julius Caesar, so had to learn some of those long monologues. But I think you don't appreciate perhaps as much, when you're young, sort of some of the incredible beauty and the way it's obviously shaped so much of our language anyway. We'll come to all that as well. But I guess having a Shakespeare expert among us means we have to ask the question, though it may be like asking you to choose between your children or something. What is your favourite Shakespeare play, if any?
It's not hard for me to answer, and perhaps I should revise it because it's been my favourite for about 20 years, but it's The Winter's Tale.
Okay,
So one of
so tell
Shakespeare's
us why,
later and lesser known.
well, just assume complete ignorance on my part and the part of the listener. Would you tell us that, yeah, just briefly what The Winter's Tale is all about?
So it's as Shakespeare's plays are often about kings. This is a story of a king and a queen, and early in the play, the king becomes obsessed with the conviction that his wife has been unfaithful to him with his best friend Polixenes. So the king is Leontes, his friend is Polixenes, and that Hermione, his wife, is actually carrying Polixenes' child, and she's about 9 months pregnant at this time. So things take off rather quickly in this play. But I kind of need to fast forward to the very end of the play. He treats her appallingly. He mistrusts everything she says, and a whole lot is lost in a tragic sense, and it is classified as a tragic comedy. But at the end, we find ourselves as audience looking with Leontes at this very curious thing on stage, a statue that looks very lifelike. I think it's a kind of uncanny valley experience where he is looking at this statue of his dead wife, Hermione. She dies in the course of the play. And he doesn't quite understand what he's looking at, and nor do the audience. And Hermione's best friend, who is also a good friend to Leontes, her name is Paulina, and that's kind of significant, is hosting this tour of her gallery and is sort of narrating this statue. And Leontes just can't stop looking at it. He starts to see signs of life in it. He berates himself for his terrible treatment of his wife, who effectively died from it. He'd lost his daughter because of his jealousy. And eventually he says, I've got to touch it. I've got to touch this statue. I'm going to kiss it. And Paulina says, no, don't be crazy. The paint on the statue is still wet. You'll mess it up if you touch it. But he persists and persists. I've got to touch it. I have to touch it. And then Paulina says, okay, resolve yourself for more wonders. I can make her speak and talk. But, she says, you must awake your faith. And then she conducts this strange ceremony where the statue reaches out its hand eventually to Leontes, and he has to take that leap of faith to take her hand. And so it's a kind of resurrection scene, but why it's so special to me is very personal, in that I was an ignorant reader of this play. I was working in my early 20s as a carer for an academic who had suffered a stroke, and one of the things I used to do in my days with him was to read Shakespeare plays to him. It was a pretty good job, I thought. And I read to this extraordinary dramatic junction and had no idea what was about to happen. And I read Leontes' words as he takes her hand, "Oh, she's warm." And I felt this jolt of recognition that what I thought was happening was not happening. Something else entirely was happening. And I looked up at Philip Martin, who was a poet as well as an academic, and tears were just running down his face. And so for me, it had this double meaning within the story and within our conversation and his life and my life at the time. So I think it will always have to be my favourite. And it brings together faith and literature in a very profound way.
Yeah, I don't think you need to revise that answer. Keep with it, Kate. Keep with it. We can think, when I think of Shakespeare, he's such a culture maker. You kind of wonder, what on earth our world would look like without him. Someone should write a novel about that, you know, one of those what if novels, like what if Shakespeare hadn't existed, what would 2025 look like? But because his work is like so transcendent and it feels so global, and it's in our vocabulary, you know, and it's shaped our vocabulary in many ways, and so I think we can kind of kid ourselves into thinking that it just emerged, like it just is, you know, that it existed in like this vacuum because it's so genius. But of course it didn't, you know. It has a context, it had an origin. And so I guess like what I'm really fascinated to learn a bit more about is the cultural context of Shakespeare's time, where some of this work has emerged from.
I think it's a really great question, Belle. And I think one of the things that makes Shakespeare boring for contemporary thinkers is that idea that it's this transcendent force that always was, that didn't grow up among real contingencies or pressures the way that we live today. But of course, his work did grow up in a very specific context. One of the aspects of that context was that it was the first era of print. So a new technology is transforming the world at this moment. And that technology is enabling social mobility. It's allowing professional mobility, all sorts of new opportunities, increasing literacy, massive increase of vocabulary in this moment. It's of course before the first dictionaries, but there's an explosion of, well, it's before Johnson's dictionary, I should say, but there's an explosion of kinds of words. Neologisms are all permitted, and it's an era of curiosity about both the past and the present. New technologies of travel are permitting exploration of the world, so there's discovery of new peoples from the English standpoint, and also new animals and nature, and all of this comes into play in Shakespeare's imagination. But it's also an era of extraordinary spiritual turbulence that I think we find difficult to grasp just how traumatic this era is, in that we, of course, had Henry VIII's break from Rome earlier in the 16th century, so he pulls out from papal authority, and in that period begins the persecution of Catholics in England with the beginning of the English Reformation. And then under the reign of Mary Tudor, we have the persecution of Protestants. So in one lifespan, you could be burned at the stake for holding totally different convictions. And this is all happening just before Shakespeare is born. So I think in a popular sense, we might project back believing we know what the spiritual experience is for the 16th century. They believe this, and this, but it's a period of rupture and terrible uncertainty and extraordinary courage and conviction and faith, of course, all happening at the same time. But a slightly more appealing anecdote that I think really shows this, to do with the theatre, which you may have heard before, is that Edward Allen, the actor, when he played Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, who conjures devils in the action of Dr. Faustus, would wear a cross when he did so, just in case he accidentally effectively conjured a devil. And then there is this fabulous story in circulation in the 17th century of a performance of Dr. Faustus. I mean, Andrew Sofer suggests that this was pretty good publicity mainly, but that in that conjuring scene, an extra demon was seen on stage. So this incantation was accidentally efficacious. And so I think it demonstrates for us just how real and how close the spiritual world is for the 16th century. Marlowe was an atheist, apparently, but the theatre is this thin space, and it really capitalizes on that for entertainment.
I mean, I'd love to ask about where you think Shakespeare stood in terms of faith as well, but another factor of the kind of tumultuous religious period they were living through was that it was only fairly recently that English language versions of the Bible had, been printed and distributed. And it was still, I mean, we didn't even have the King James version by the time, Shakespeare was writing his plays. And yet I think, the Bible inevitably, in the different forms I guess Shakespeare had read it, had showed up in various ways in his work. So what were the kind of, I suppose, literary influences going on as this publishing boom happened, in the 16th century, and suddenly people were picking up books and printing books and reading books all over the place? What was Shakespeare likely reading and finding its way into his plays?
It seems just about everything he could possibly get his hands on. So it's very clear that strong formative influences in his grammar school training were Ovid's Metamorphoses, particularly in Latin. But then, and then the most common book that anybody could ever get in their hands at that moment was, of course, the Bible, and probably for Shakespeare, the Bishop's Bible. Which was a mid-16th century English Bible. And the Bible had a drama behind it of its own. As you pointed out, people had died to make the Bible available in English vernacular. And so it wasn't like the good old Gideons in our hotel rooms today, in the sense everyone, or we can look it up. The Bible was precious in the sense that so much human courage had to be spent to make it available to people, particularly of Shakespeare's class. So he wasn't aristocratic, he didn't have any special privilege, he was of the artisan class, and suddenly the Bible in the English vernacular was delivered into the hands of people like Shakespeare. Some people would have said for better or worse. So there's the Bible and Ovid. But then there's reading works in translation. So Thomas North's Plutarch's The Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans, which we can see influencing all his Roman plays. And it has to be said, same with Hall's and Holinshed's English Chronicles. Shakespeare just takes whole passages, tweaks a few. If it's good, why change it? So we have characters literally speaking what Holinshed wrote in his chronicles.
I mean, was that just normal? Of a bit of plagiarism was kind of part of the culture at that time?
Well, you only have to think about the tech industry today and social media. This is a new social technology, so it's fairly unregulated, I suppose.
Yeah.
And not only that, Shakespeare steals from living authors of his own period, so that the term upstart crow for Shakespeare it's a jab at him for stealing the ideas of people who thought they were more qualified to be poets and dramatists than he, particularly Robert Greene in that instance. And as I said, the Bible is a huge influence on Shakespeare's imagination.
I guess we don't think of plagiarizing the Bible these days because it just is sort of a baseline for so much kind of literary inspiration. But I guess I want to come back to that question of how much Shakespeare was using the Bible, and you've already mentioned in The Winter's Tale, for instance, strong Christian themes come through, and I'm sure in many other Shakespeare plays as well. But to what extent was that just sort of the cultural air he was breathing, and to what extent was he actually was there a personal faith that he was potentially investing in the stories and plays that he wrote?
Shakespeare is very unguessable, particularly if we're just looking at the evidence of his creative work. They're plays, so they're polyphonic, and it's hard to see where Shakespeare's own deep spiritual convictions lie. So, and people have talked about his crypto-Catholic identity. If we believe that his will is his own wording, then his hope, his Christian hope, is bracingly real and clear at the end of his life. But others have suggested that the words in his will are just form words that anyone would put at the end of their will, that they hope for salvation through Jesus Christ. So he himself is unguessable, but I think there are many, many different ways in which his biblically inflected imagination comes to the fore, particularly in his drama. And the one that I can list a few of them if you like. I mean,
Yeah, go ahead, please.
obviously, there's cultural details from the Hebrew scriptures. So in The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare clearly knows all about Jacob and Laban's goats, the ins and outs of these details of Hebrew scripture. But there's also stylistically a poetic psalm-like cadence. If we think of Portia's speech in The Merchant of Venice, the quality of mercy is not strained. There's a psalm-like feeling, texture to that stylistically. But I think what interests me most is the radical intervention into power that Shakespeare seems to illuminate from the Gospels. So the ephemerality of human beings is a really strong theme in Shakespeare, and the upsetting of earthly authority and the revelation that it is not what it purports to be. And this is, of course, very risky business when your patron happens to be the highest bureaucrat in the land, when Shakespeare is the Lord Chamberlain's men and then later the King's men. It's a dangerous game to play, to be showing that kings and queens are nothing more than human beings, are nothing more than dust. And yet, and listen to these amazing words from Richard II when he discovers that all his followers are leaving him and defecting to Bolingbroke's side, and basically he's going to be usurped. He says, "Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs." And he says this fantastic thing. It's going to be one of my favourite quotes. It's so simple. "For you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king?" And one of the things that occurs to me about this distilling process when royalty shows itself to be mortal is this movement to monosyllables. I live with bread like you. So even stylistically, there's this emptying out, this recognition that last will be first and first will be last, which seems to me to be that gospel revolution playing out consciously or unconsciously, but powerfully artistically in Shakespeare's own expression. And then another take we have on that is the speaking the truth to power, the wonderful, bold, eloquent assaults on privilege and power that we see playing out. And it's very often women. Wonderful Catherine of Aragon taking Wolsey down in Henry VIII, Hermione in The Winter's Tale, and one of my favourites is Isabella in Measure for Measure. Man, proud man, dressed in a little brief authority, most ignorant of what he's most assured. His glassy essence, like an angry ape, plays such fantastic tricks before heaven as makes the angels weep. So there's this powerful, this speaking the truth to power. She's a woman, so in this era, in a sense, what right does she have to be speaking? And yet she speaks such bold truth to power. So yes, that topsy-turvy flip of the gospel seems to be generating for us is somehow there in the imagination.
I have another theme as well that I want to ask you about in regards to that. But before I do, I'm just curious. You know, you mentioned about the printing. This is really the era where that printing technology is coming into play. And I think I've seen, so Shakespeare's generation was Generation Red, because they were much more visually literate than the parents' generation. And so I'm just curious, and the answer might be really practical and not deep at all, but why was he writing plays? Why didn't he just write books? And I'm wondering if there's something about his words being embodied that was important to him. But I am also aware it might just be a very practical because it was much cheaper.
I, in a sense, I can only speculate, but I absolutely love the question. It's right up my alley. He did publish books, of course. So Venus and Adonis in the 1590s and the Rape of the Creche, and then later in the early 17th century, he publishes his sonnets. So he was in the business. He had his hand in a lot of pies, but I'd love to say it was his sense of educational access, because over 50% of the population is still illiterate, of the population is still illiterate at this moment. So people can come and see plays who can't read books. But I think that's very unlikely. I wonder if it's a case of shared risk economically and artistically. So he doesn't come from an aristocratic background. He's not well funded to go about the expensive process of producing lots and lots of books. But if he goes in with a group of friends and makes theatre happen, he's splitting the risk economically. And he was a pretty formidable business person, Shakespeare. So this would never have been far from his thoughts. But if we want to move to a more poetic vein,
please,
yes, I think that he built his own theatre with the help of his friends and sharers. He acted on its stage, so he has a really exquisite sense of how body and space make meaning. And he would have potentially had that feeling from grammar school, where reciting and acting and playing and debating was part of the educational curriculum. But if I take you to some examples, perhaps, of moments in the plays, it's just so obvious why it's more powerful that they're embodied than written. So the first one that comes to mind is Gloucester on Dover Cliff in King Lear, when his son, Gloucester, is blind, and his son leads his father to what his father believes is his suicide. He says, "Take me to the edge of the cliff, I'm done." And Edgar doesn't lead him to the edge of a cliff. He leads him to perhaps a tiny drop, the size of a curb on a road or something. And so on the stage, we get to see this old man who's had his eyes plucked out think that his life is going to end. And when he throws himself, he just falls on the ground. He just falls on the stage in front of us. And that, to me, that's my kind of answer, is that the poetry of the body in that moment, as well as the exquisite verbal poetry that follows, is such a powerful way of communicating the tragedy of what's happening. And it's the same for the kings taking apart their kingship. Richard II sitting, looking convincing like a king, but sitting on the ground. He says, "Let us sit upon the ground." Hermione's statue, which I've just described to you, Lady Macbeth trying to get this blood on her hands that her conscience is put there. It's the combination of words and Shakespeare's exquisite literacy about space, movement, and bodies that it was just his art form. It was just the art form that he seemed to have this exquisite feel for.
I like what you said much earlier as well. I think when you were talking about Faustus, that story is that the theatre was a thin space. I like that. And a space of belonging and community as well, I guess, which is also really interesting. Thank you. That really satisfied my my itch for that question.
I think that sense of a shared, you've just pointed out, the shared risk with his sharers in the company, but also it's a shared creative risk with the audience, because the
Yeah.
audience collaboration is what makes the play happen, and the plays themselves acknowledge this. At the beginning of Henry V, we have the chorus saying, "Imagine you see this and this and this." So the audience are part of the risk and part of the reward as well.
Yeah, it reminds me, it's not at all the same context, but it definitely has parallels. I did biblical studies and I specifically looked at the Gospel of John and his ancient media culture and how they told stories. And as part of that, I remember I wrote a chapter on the fact that the audience help with the meaning making. So it's, John can say something, or Shakespeare can just put something out there and he doesn't need to be explicit about it. He'll just put a fact out there, or a little detail out there, or a little hint or a clue out there. And then the audience are part of this process of like meaning making, because it's what it touches in their own lives or in their own contexts or their understanding of royalty or all of that. And it's such a communal endeavor, the meaning making. And I guess what's beautiful about that is we're context-wise, we're so far removed, but we're still doing that. It's still landing in new contexts, and that means that new audiences can still be a part of this meaning-making process in a way.
Yes,
which is really cool.
I mean, I would argue that that's the perpetual process of re-enchantment of Shakespeare, is through performance, and performance in contexts that Shakespeare could never have anticipated. Has a particularly interesting re-enchantment value. I mean, my writing is a great deal about Shakespeare in Australia and how Shakespeare's plays intersect with the preoccupations of a particular socio-political context. So that's the ignition point, I think.
I guess that makes me want to ask, as we've sort of come to that, why are we still acting, reading, performing Shakespeare some 500 years later? Because at one level, there is a sort of a barrier. There is a language barrier that perhaps didn't exist so much in his day, where when my kids sit down and try to learn Shakespeare lines, it feels like they're learning a foreign language to begin with until they know what it means. I remember going through with my son when he was trying to learn lines for The Merchant of Venice, and I literally had to say, well, this is what this means, and then he could kind of commit it to memory, because otherwise he just felt like he was sort of trying to commit to memory random words because he wasn't really aware of what the meaning was. But so there's kind of that barrier at one level, and yet it still seems to speak to every generation. And, we constantly have, the latest reinvention and repurposing of Shakespeare in some form or another. So why is the enchantment in Shakespeare sort of buried so deep that it can kind of come out every time that a new generation starts to dig into and perform his plays?
I think paradoxically, it has to do with it being so deeply embedded in its own contingencies, so real to their own moment. Somehow, because it's so specific, it's so universal in one sense. So there's such a astute observation of how the power dynamics of the court or of London, or I guess of ancient Rome through Plutarch, are operating. It's so incisive that it can come alive, and when it rubs up against new contingencies in culture that echo it. I think particularly that meditation on power it seems always to stay relevant. But the other thing I think is that partly the difficulty is the pleasure. And I see this with students all the time. Students come to the course saying, I'm scared of Shakespeare, or even I hate Shakespeare. And I'm really glad when they say that, because I think it's a really strong feeling. We can do something with that. And then recently helping some young actors prepare for auditions for performance, and then the stakes are higher, right? Because they have to make meaning of the words, and to see them opening this thing up and these light bulb moments happening as they take time to unpack that complex syntactical units and find that meaning in themselves. Very, very rewarding experience. So I was working with a young actor last year, and he was working on the speech where Macbeth says, is this a dagger before me? It's handled towards my hand. And this was such a revelation to him. He said it's not just neutral hanging in the air there. It's goading him to take hold of it. His own imagination is pushing him to take hold of it. So yeah, I think the language is both the barrier and the bridge if our curiosity is up to it. And we need to remember that complex language has not always been seen as an obstacle. So in Shakespeare's moment, the more kinds of words you had, the more kinds of feelings you could express, and the more breadth of human experience you could probe with language. So the idea that to be simple is always good, is problematic. And yet you have those magnificent moments in Shakespeare where it becomes monosyllabic and this feeling of disillusionment comes through, like Macbeth's out, brief candle. You don't need any help to understand what's happening in that moment. So
yeah. It's really interesting what you said about also it being really rooted in his particular context. And I guess that's intriguing because we read some of his work and, you know, there's that whole thing of actually there's nothing new under the sun. So you read something really specific. Like I remember reading King Lear I did it for A-level. And this is a really specific story about specific characters. And also it speaks so powerfully into Shakespeare's own context, and yet you can see similarities in your own context of people who are on your own news cycle, and you think, oh my goodness, you know, in the more particular he got, oddly, the more universal in resonance it has become. And I think, if I can quote you to you, I read a piece that you wrote for the conversation about Macbeth, and you wrote this quote that Shakespeare keeps the inner dimension perpetually before the audience. And so I guess if I'm understanding you correctly, sort of that means that, say, for example, a murder happens. It's not just like Shakespeare wants you to see the murder happen. He wants you to see the inner workings of how that murder has bubbled up, the mechanics, you know, the interior mechanics of how that came to be, but also the way that there's been a rupture and a fracture as a result. And so I'm just kind of interested, is Shakespeare interested in teaching us about our own inner lives? Is that kind of... was that a specific curiosity for him, and is that a specific aim for him? And then if so, I imagine, does that play into why it's so universally meaningful?
I think our paradigm of inner and outer lives is possibly the wrong model for even thinking about what 16th century consciousness would, particularly the existence of the inner life. It would be a crazy question in this moment, because it's so patently obvious that the inner life, the spiritual, the conscience is so much a part of all of life. But I do think what Shakespeare does is dramatizes choice making, moral choice making, and makes it live exposes it live for us through soliloquies in a way that possibly no other dramatist does. That's a big claim, and I'm sure I'll have the Marlowe and Johnson experts after me. But it's this knife edge moment of decision making that Shakespeare is able to dramatize characters. And I think Macbeth, as you were alluding to, is a really wonderful example of that. Moments of making a resolution to do something, moments of changing, of a person changing their mind nobody changes their mind anymore. Nobody changes their mind. Everybody has a position, and the job of life seems to be to fortify that position as effectively as possible. But drama needs change and conflict, and so seeing a character actually change their mind in a comic vein, as in Much Ado About Nothing, we have those wonderful parallel soliloquies of Benedict and Beatrice changing their mind about each other. And then in tragedy, of course, we have people changing their mind in the form of repentance of some form. And at the end of Lear, we have Lear asking Cordelia to administer poison to him because he deserves it. And she says he has cause, and she forgives and says no cause, no cause. So that's what I would say, is that Shakespeare dramatizes the inner world particularly through soliloquy, through these moments of intimacy where a character goes back and forth. I mean, Brutus' speech in Julius Caesar is just magnificent, where he's really willing himself into the assassination of Caesar, and he says, "Reason thus," and you can see him pulled between two poles. The same with Macbeth. I have nothing to spur me to this act, but vaulting ambition. He says to Lady Macbeth, "We shall proceed no further in this business. He's made a decision," and she says, "Was the hope drunk in which you dressed yourself?" And then she, through this assault on his masculinity, manages to draw him back to something he's perfectly capable of himself, which is this atrocious act of assassination.
As you say, it was an age when they didn't, in a sense, think of in necessarily spiritual and non-spiritual categories. You know, life was spiritual at some level, and so, as you say, in these soliloquies, he's dramatizing that inner conversation, that life, that the conscience, if you like, that was so apparent to Shakespeare's age. Perhaps less so today, because obviously we live, you know, at 400 or 500 years hence, and lots of people have sort of, you know, cast doubt on whether there is such a thing as a soul or a conscience or whatever. I suppose, you know, you can still obviously enjoy Shakespeare whether or not you're a believer, a Christian, or whatever. Does the fact that you have a Christian faith, Kate, make a difference to the way you do engage Shakespeare and those issues around conscience, good and evil, forgiveness, right and wrong, and so on? Does it help at some level to in that sense share some of his worldview that he was writing out of?
I think not very consciously until very recently. I think I have been very compartmentalized in my intellectual life and my spiritual life, but I still think that subconsciously, yes, I think a knowledge of the Bible is an indispensable key to lots and lots of facets of culture, but particularly a key to understanding, I'd say, not Shakespeare's beliefs necessarily, but the sensibility in which he was operating. As you can probably tell, I'm quite hesitant to say that Shakespeare was or wasn't anything himself, but that doesn't mean that through his works we don't get moments of revelation. But for this interview, I was thinking about it more directly, and I think that it means I read the Bible for drama. And I feel like Shakespeare, this is a really exciting thought to me, and one that I've yet to flesh out. But I think Shakespeare is dramaturgically coached by the Bible and by the Gospels, particularly the quality of encounter that characters have with Jesus Christ. And I was thinking specifically of John Belle, of the Gospel of John. They just bear this texture of real human moments, of the gaps between human beings, of the unsaid, and they're so physical. They're such sensuous moments, these encounters between Christ and people. And two come to mind. One is the healing at the pool, Bethesda, early in John, where Jesus says to the man who's been sitting there for 38 years in a queue, he says to him, do you want to be well? And the man doesn't say yes. So the dramaturgy is really sophisticated. He doesn't say, of course I do, or what do you think? Or he's so in his own system. We imagine he's just staring at the pool saying, oh, every time the water gets stirred up, I can't get into the pool. And there's a massive dramatic irony going on there, that this source of life, this person who calls himself the water of life, is right there in front of him, and the man is still in his own imagination in this queue, in a system that he is, in a sense, enchanted in a bad sense, and he needs to be disenchanted out of that. And then there's a beautiful example. One of my absolute favourites is toward the end of John, when Mary meets the risen Christ, and again there's this fantastic cross purposes. He says to her, "Why are you crying?" And you can imagine all this emotion tumbling out. They've taken my Lord away. I don't know where they've put him. If you've taken him somewhere, tell me so I can go and get him. What she thought she was going to do is amazing. But it says that she thought he was the gardener, which I just think is absolutely amazing, because some part of her has already grasped some truth. She's getting warmer. He is, in a sense, if he is who he says he is the gardener. He is this transformative force that breathes life into the earth. And yet it's sort of like the snow starting to melt in Narnia. She's not quite there. And then he says her name. Oh, he says her name. He says Mary. And then that moment of recognition. And again, I would say it's a kind of release from a bad sort of enchantment takes place in that moment. And she sees her saviour, and she turns to him and calls out Rabboni. And I just see these moments of recognition and release from the knot of enchantment happening in Shakespeare's plays all the time. Both in comedy, it's that wonderful happy kind of let the world be peopled kind of Benedict moment. But in tragedy, in King Lear, for instance, it's a form of release where light floods in on a sad scene because so much harm and so much damage has been done. But there's still this possibility in Lear and Hamlet of forgiveness and reconciliation. Death is inevitable. The stage will be littered with bodies, but I think it's like a river finally being released into the bigger truth of the sea. There's this moment of release that happens at the end of the tragedies. It has strands of Aristotle's dramatic theory in there as well, but I think Shakespeare's dramatic designs are deep down informed by reading the Bible. It's the first time I've really unpacked that idea.
Kate, let's merge our worlds. Let's write something together. Oh, that's so interesting. That's so good, because my next question, and you've already touched upon it, you've led so perfectly into it, is, you know, as the Re-Enchanting podcast, we are always kind of like picking at and trying to seek out, you know, where these themes of like awe and transcendence and mystery and kind of an aching for more, you know, a connectedness, you know, all of these words, all of these longings, all of these cravings, we're constantly trying to seek out where they show up in different pockets of culture. And so you've already kind of led us straight in, but I'm just wondering, because I can't get enough of it, if you could talk a little bit more about those, basically about enchantment in Shakespeare's work.
So it has a really different currency, and I feel like I'm going to get in trouble here, because enchantment in the the 16th century is mainly a very dangerous and bad thing, not something
Yes.
that you would want. If we look at its history in the dictionary, it has to do with incantation and having a spell put on you. So so there's that element of seduction, being captive to an illusion. But in the 16th century, art and drama and poetry are suspect because they dabble in these arts of enchantment. So Shakespeare himself in his plays shows that he is aware he's dealing with dark materials. And I think that Prospero is a fantastic example of that, where at the end of The Tempest, he drowns his book and breaks his staff. It's as if he's resigning those powers, and then he uses the word enchant. He says, now I want or I lack, I don't have spirits to enforce or art to enchant. And my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. And then he asked the audience, as you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. Can you clap for my play, please?
That was very
Flawless.
So that Shakespeare is playing with the dark idea of enchantment, but I think it has varied currencies, and that nearly all the plots have this almost knot of enchantment that comes undone in a powerful way at the end. You know, a little example that I came across when I looked up enchant through Shakespeare's plays, that the word enchantment is used by King Polixenes as an insult. He spits it out at the character Perdita in The Winter's Tale, because she's had the hide to get engaged as a shepherd girl. She thinks she's a shepherd girl to his son, the prince. So she said, he turns to her and says, thou enchantment. So you can see that it has a different currency, and I don't think people in this era are as hungry for it, because there's not a sense that it's the tide hasn't receded. there's not a sense.
Yeah, it's not lacking.
Yeah, it's not lacking. I'd say that the way the word itself is used in Shakespeare is very different. But I'm quite interested in the dramaturgical design, how it seems to have this loop of enchantment that then ends in a moment of release.
Yeah, and that's not total. I remember we did an episode on politics. So like, it was with Luke Brotherton. We in the UK were just about to have a general election, so we pulled in the wisest political commentator we know to help us out. And he said, so our title was Re-Enchanting Politics. And I remember Luke said, before you can re-enchant politics, I think we might have to disenchant it. And it's a little bit like what you were just saying about the man at the pool in the Bible who wanted to be healed, or those examples of enchantment in Shakespeare, so fixated on the one thing sometimes that actually a re-enchantment is a disenchantment. It's an undoing of being fixated on a wrong thing, or being, inappropriately fixated, or, which is really interesting that's still, albeit in a different kind of way. That's still how Shakespeare plays out on the cultural stage, right? That's still happening. We still do that. We still are enchanted with things that don't deserve our enchantment, maybe, to put it that way.
They don't deserve so much of our attention as they
yes
they get.
Certainly.
I mean, I should say, because I sound like I'm absolutely lionising everything Shakespeare ever wrote, that there is a lot of terrible Shakespeare. And that plays in order to have their power on the stage have to be diligently cut and dealt with by contemporary artists whose lives are in touch with contemporary sensibilities and concerns. So the creative practice element of Shakespeare goes on. When you think of all those cultural allusions that are just such dead weights when student productions particularly want to keep every single word, and like the pancakes and the mustard in As You Like It. Just let's get rid of that.
Well,
Yeah.
as you said, Shakespeare was pretty, liberal with the way he sliced and diced other people's work. So in a sense, there's no shame in doing the same with his at some level. I mean, just as we bring this into land, Kate, and it's been such a fun conversation. And I will have to get your recommendation, given that you say, not all Shakespeare is alike, where I should begin in my journey into Shakespeare when I do start to, dig into that complete works. But so some kind of order of which plays to start with would be helpful.
Okay, you're on.
Okay, I'll look out for the email. But I suppose I wanted to just sort of finish up by asking, whether you sense that in your experience there is a kind of a growing hunger in any way for this kind of re-enchantment. I suppose I'm speaking from my personal experience. I think that as we live in an age where increasingly everything is mediated through technology, and where AI, frankly, can do a not bad impersonation of Shakespeare if it wants to, but it's just being produced by kind of algorithms and, ones and zeros, whether there's a bit of a revival in people wanting poetry, meaning, the depth, the richness, I suppose, that a Shakespeare brings, when we've got, frankly, so much surface level dross at our fingertips through technology now. I've been noticing perhaps that people are starting to think, actually, no, we need to go back to the ancients. We need this stuff that, that we've kind of forgotten in our rush to kind of have everything digitized and, algorithms. And I don't know whether you get the sense that there's any kind of growing interest in an area that's often, frankly, overlooked, when it comes to funding arts and everything else. What's your view as an academic in this area?
Well, I guess I have a relatively limited sample size. The people that I mix with tend to want Shakespeare, but I can certainly say that the student demand of Shakespeare for Shakespeare has been undiminished in my 20 years teaching in universities. It's often my colleagues who I have to convince that Shakespeare should have a place on the curriculum. And I love public humanities kinds of events, and there seems to be plenty of demand for that. And I think part of that comes back to what Belle mentioned earlier, the communal moment of making meaning together, which it is just irreplaceable, and it becomes more miraculous to people and to young people as they have less and less of that experience of sharing space and time. And Shakespeare's constantly showing the threadbare means of theatre making. It's this sense of it's a little bit like a magician saying you can see every side of the box. There's nothing going on, and then what comes out of the box. Shakespeare's dramatic approach seems constantly to be, see, I've got nothing here. It's a bare stage. When we think of Shakespeare, our imagination is a bit tainted by our sense of Victorian Shakespeare. So this picture stage Shakespeare where there are real rabbits and real deer and real rivers on the stage. But Shakespeare was constantly showing that he had nothing hidden, and that all the power that was generated from the story was the combination of the audience's imagination, confederate imagination, and the magic of the language brought alive, embodied by skilled actors. And I went to a wonderful event last year called the Poetry of Violence, which was an initiative by the Belle Shakespeare Company, which is very active here in Australia. And it wasn't a full stage production of anything. It was excerpts from Shakespeare showing the workings, showing how you get from the words to the feeling, in a sense. And it was the best Shakespeare play I've been to for a long time. And a sense in the audience of that moment, how can you turn that dialogue when the plotters kill Caesar and and then they somehow convince themselves that they should bathe their hands in his blood because that's going to make everybody confident that they're the right people to seize power. And you can feel in the theatre people relating it to things that have happened yesterday in their world and on the news. So I think it is that collaborative meaning-making, powerfully designed dramaturgy and the being together in space and time that does have an appeal that perhaps is escalating as we spend so much more of our time looking at screens and not so much being in our bodies.
Kate, there is so much more we could ask you. I've never been more sad to see my clock ticking away. Firstly, Justin, I hope you're suitably inspired to have a year full of Shakespeare.
I am. I'm looking out for the email, Kate, and tell me where I begin, and sort of dip my toes in gently. That's all I'm saying. And I don't know. Is it ever worth should I just, drink it wholesale, or should I have some kind of commentary next to it?
I think you should listen.
What do you think is the best approach?
I think you should listen to it. There's, choose actors whose voices you love and listen to them speaking it. And you can read along if you want. That's how I learned to read. Yes. But that's often what I say to my students, because you get all this information through voice, tone, pace, and volume to help interpret what you're reading on the page. That it just gives you so much more cues. There are so many, it's so much richer.
Well, the way it was meant to be originally experienced, I suppose, from the stage by most of the audiences.
Audience has audio in it.
The good news is I will be having those experiences that you can never have again, Kate, of encountering some of this stuff probably for the first time, and really, I'll report back on my conversion to Shakespeare.
Okay, I'm a bit jealous. Maybe don't start with Timon of Athens. I saved that one till last, and I read it. I listened to it on a very long haul flight, and it was a tough listen.
Okay, all right. Well, hence why I need your help in deciding where I begin. But again, thank you so much. It's been really fun, and I'm definitely inspired to go and listen and read some more Shakespeare. Thank you very much for being our guest on Re-Enchanting today, and we'll make sure to link to some of the articles and bits and pieces. You've got a fabulous talk that you gave recently on some of those influences on Shakespeare as well. We'll make sure all that gets linked from today's show. But for now, thank you so much for Re-Enchanting Shakespeare with us today, Kate.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Belle. It's been a great pleasure.
And thank you so much for joining us. I hope that just like Justin, you are chomping at the bit to dig into Shakespeare. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Re-Enchanting. As was said earlier, every review, every subscription, all of it always helps. And also, if you are interested in making more conversations like this happen, then seenandunseen.com/give is where you can head to. But for now, we will see you next time.